This video is inspired by tierzoo. Now, if you played the game back in the day, the sight of me being one-shot by this build doesn't really surprise you. Its insane crit potential and size made this a common occurrence. This build was the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Formed from a small group of theropod mains during the Lake Cretaceous expansion, about 90 million years ago, who got the itch to see what happens when you max out the bite ability. And little did they know, this ability combined with a few others would lead to one of the most famous builds in the game. A lot of this build is shrouded in anger, with many people claiming there was just no counterplay. So I want to discuss and answer the question, was the T-Rex really overpowered? And to understand that, let's first do an overview of the basic history of the dinosaur faction and the events that led up to the dominance of this particular group. The dinosaur faction first appeared in the Triassic expansion 230 million years ago, but didn't really become the dominant faction until the Jurassic was released 200 million years ago. This dominance came from some really innovative build techniques, with many players leveling up skill trees never before seen. Some players started stacking health items and invested all of their evolution points into enhancing their bulkiness, with this path eventually leading to the sauropods, the largest land-based animal builds ever seen in the game. Others put points into new defensive strategies, becoming the ornithischians, and changing the entire meta in terms of tankiness. Meanwhile, the theropod players continued down the path of bipedal predation, pioneered by the first dinosaurs in the Triassic, fine-tuning this class and eventually enabling them to become the most dominant predators in every land server. And this brings us to around 170 million years ago, when some theropod players began down the tree line that started the development of the T-Rex. The Tyrannosaur guild came from some pretty humble beginnings. The early Tyrannosaur builds were actually one of the smaller predator builds at the time. And because of this, the Tyrannosaur mains decided not to compete with the larger and more powerful land predators, like the Ceratosaur, Megalosaur, and Allosaur. Those builds were just far too powerful to compete with on raw strength, so the Tyrannosaur players had to find other ways to remain viable. Instead of direct competition, the Tyrannosaur mains opted for some different adaptations, and would try to fill the niche similar to that of the Coyote mains we have today. So what were those adaptations? Well, they initially spec'd into some traits that really had been neglected by most Mesozoic era players. Specifically, they did this by advancing their brains and upgrading their mobility. Most dinosaurs of the time had some pretty mediocre intelligence stats, so the Tyrannosaur guild took advantage of this and decided to spec into it. At the time, the move was criticized by a big portion of the player base. Nevertheless, they followed through and eventually gave them some of the highest intelligence stats ever seen in the game up to that point. Combined with this, they also focused on upgrading their senses, and they did this by enlarging their cochleas and olfactory bulbs, which leveled up their hearing and smelling. They also decided to tap into some render distance maxing mechanics, leveling up their eyes to the point where Tyrannosaur mains could see objects clearly from about 4 miles away. All these adaptations gave them higher loot drop collection potential, but besides senses, another stat they decided to upgrade was mobility. In today's meta, when we hear mobility being talked about, we usually assume speed, but in the early game, mobility was thought of much differently. Compared to now, most builds were pretty slow, so you didn't actually have to be that fast to be viable. But what set the Tyrannosaurs apart was their endurance and agility. Compared to other theropods, Tyrannosaurs had shorter bodies and enlarged upper hips, which leveled up their turn radius to the point where they could turn twice as fast as builds of the same size. Adding to this, the meta they inhabited, mobility was really just viewed as a dump stat for most of the players. So this small boost in agility really gave the build some fun, fast-paced mechanics that was sorely lacking in this tank-filled meta. And as for endurance, combined with the theropod's already efficient breathing abilities, the Tyrannosaurs added to this by devoting more points into long legs, making their leg-to-body ratio higher than any other dinosaur of their size, which optimized their energy consumption and lowered the mana cost of their movement abilities. Now these traits really helped the Tyrannosaurs carve out a small but respectable niche. By undermining the meta standards, it allowed them to remain viable even against the much more popular and powerful builds at the time. But even with these upgrades, it didn't get them anywhere near game-breaking power. So how did the Tyrannosaur players convert their build to be considered one of the most overpowered in all of the game's history? For that, you have to look towards the Lake Cretaceous expansion about 90 million years ago, when the Allosaurus builds that were previously the most dominant predators of North America suddenly faded out of the meta. This created an opportunity for the Tyrannosaur players to fill in their recently vacated role as the top predators in their respective servers. And they did this by spending the evolution points they had saved up over the previous few million years. So to do this, they started to unlock further into the size tree line, slowly increasing their size, where by the time the T-Rex rolled out around 68 million years ago, they had gone from horse-like proportions to being larger than any land animal alive today, making making the T-Rex the most massive predator to ever exist on any land server. But it wasn't just the size that made the T-Rex so formidable. The Tyrannosaurus had a huge skull and teeth that were optimized to give their bite attack the maximum possible amount of power. The bite of the T-Rex was the most powerful ever seen in any land animal, with a force equivalent to the weight of 3 small cars and more than double any predator in the meta today. Because of this, they also unlocked the bone-crushing bite passive, which was a crucial skill to unlock, especially in the Cretaceous meta. One effect of this new ability was that it let them tap into some legendary loot drops, giving them the opportunity to more effectively consume bone, increasing their XP farm rate. Though the more important benefit of the bone-crushing bite passive was that during the Cretaceous, nearly every large herbivore player spec'd in some insane health stats and defense stats that could block all but the most damaging of attacks. And this bite force really was a great counterpick against those adaptations, giving them the option to either insta-kill smaller targets or to use their buffed armor penetration stats to damage the large herbivore defenses, leaving them as one of the only carnivore builds that can reliably farm XP from the biggest herbivore mains. Now, there's some debate to what the best strat was for the T-Rex to farm XP, with some claiming T-Rex's strengths were used less for the purposes of hunting and more for stealing kills from smaller, weaker predators. But this is mostly a myth. Everybody knows, like nearly all carnivore players, T-Rex mains were not above kill stealing when the opportunity presented itself, but it really wasn't that important of a part of their playstyle. You might think this might be a poor strategy choice, since stealing carcasses from smaller predators would likely be easier than killing heavily armored tanks. But there's a reason for it. When a player hits their game over and their loot isn't collected, their XP amounts slowly decay if not consumed in time, basically making scavenging the remains that other players left behind a much less energetically efficient feeding strategy than griefing other players yourself and consuming them quickly, which is a pretty cool mechanic the devs added to the game to make sure that meat eaters actually have to try and game over other players. And for high-level T-Rex mains who had enormous mana costs from their massive size and complex brains, decaying XP was not the best solution for them. It made it essential to go for the most valuable loot available, and that meant hunting their own food as much as possible. This mechanic ensured that the set of abilities that the T-Rex had to acquire was well adapted to hunt and kill the strongest prey, which allowed it to establish itself as by far the most dominant predator build in one of the most fiercely competitive metas ever seen in the game. It's crazy to think that no one thought of this build sooner, but maybe hindsight is 2020. But with all these upsides, did the T-Rex really have any weaknesses? Well, as powerful as the T-Rex was, its one notorious weakness was its very small arms. The first Tyrannosaurus started off with pretty large arms, but over time took more and more points away from that, and the question of why they made this choice and what purpose, if any, these small arms may have served have inspired no end of speculation, with former Tyrannosaur mains having given all manner of contradictory answers to this question. But I believe they made this choice so they could focus more points into developing their powerful jaws. Nevertheless, their small arms have always been a place to poke fun at the T-Rex mains, but in all reality, their weak and small arms were a worthy sacrifice for their other insane adaptations. So it's time to answer the question, was T-Rex really overpowered? Even with its tiny arms, the T-Rex was still undeniably overpowered, and was so OP in fact that they were the only large predator builds in the servers that they inhabited. And why this lack of diversity? Dinosaurs, being reptiles, could not give birth to live young. That meant that unlike elephants, whales, and most other modern day megafauna builds, recently spawned in large dinosaurs would start off at a much lower level. So for the low level T-Rex players, in order to level up and actually reach their OP sizes, they had to eat a lot, and since they couldn't yet hunt the highest level prey, they had to hunt the mid-tier prey until they reached a higher level, which meant that any predator builds who also wanted to hunt the mid-tier targets would have to compete for food with growing T-Rexes, and nobody dared to risk that. Or if anyone did, they didn't last long enough to leave any trace behind. Even when not at full power, the T-Rex was still so good that trying to challenge it was basically impossible. To put this into perspective, when looking at the Africa server, the most challenging server currently in the game, lions hold the spot as one of the most overpowered and meta-centralizing builds in the game because of how hard they dominate over other large predators in their environment. But if lions were as meta-centralizing as a T-Rex, they would have forced all other builds on this list out of the game completely, leaving the honey badger as the second largest predator in Africa, which would just be insane to think about. This complete dominance over their respective servers easily places the T-Rex build near the top of the S tier for the Cretaceous meta, and among the most powerful predator builds outside has ever seen. But due to how OP it was, many streamers started picking it up and blowing its popularity out of the water, and a huge outcry to ban the T-Rex build quickly came. But instead, the devs decided to completely change the meta and brought the ban hammer down to all of the dinosaurs except for a small group of birds. But the infamy of the T-Rex lives on more than any other build in the history of the game. And even though it's currently unplayable, T-Rex still lives on in the hearts of fans. And anytime you see a fanfiction or forum thread or meme paying tribute to the former glory of the dinosaur faction, T-Rex is particularly guaranteed to get at least a shout out.